All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Let me tell you a little bit what I would like to do this afternoon. When we were talking about my presentation, there was a question of, okay, so what topics would be particularly interesting to the audience? And what we came up with was a list of 3 topics, and I'll be touching on each of those, as we're going to see, progressively, because they follow a sort of telescoping sequence that speaks to how we use technology across a range of scenarios, and then ultimately try to get the maximum mileage, the maximum improvement in student outcomes from it. So let's start right there. And if I can go to first slide. All right, so the question then, the first topic or the first aspect is, what do we want to see happen at the most micro scale? In other words, what's happening in the individual classroom? What happens in terms of how do we use the technology and SAMR to help guide the use of that technology to improve student outcomes? And that's what I'm going to talk about first. So if we can go next slide. Okay, so here's SAMR. I know most of you are familiar already with SAMR, so I'm not going to redo a basic introduction to the model. But there's a couple of things I find that even people who've been using SAMR for a while, it's worthwhile reminding. First, you can always think of SAMR as the intersection of 2 strands. One strand that has to do, yes, with technology. So I have a new technology that does some things that the old technology couldn't do. I have a new technology that does some things better than the old technology could. I have some things that I can do with the new technology that are very different than what the old technology could accomplish. So I'm always looking at a scenario where an older technology existed and a new technology comes into play. And it's important to look at that as, yes, it's an expansion of a world of possibilities and so on, but by itself, it can't account for what actually happens in the classroom. To do that, you have to think of the second strand. And the second strand is, how do teachers respond to changes? And yes, one change might be a technological change, but it could also be a change in curricular approaches, a change in pedagogical approaches, etc. So what happens in a teacher's practice? Does it remain the same? Does a teacher seek out new possibilities? Do they seek out modifications? Do they think about, why was I doing that in the first place? How do I change that? What could I now accomplish, etc.? And this applies to any change. So when you have the intersection of those 2 strands, the strand of the technology and the strand of what happens in a teacher's practice, is where you get the SAMR model. And that's important to keep in mind. Remember, technology or a particular use of technology by itself does nothing guaranteed in terms of outcomes. Just looking at how a teacher's practice changes also doesn't tell you very much, because, well, what are the tools that enable that teacher to make certain ideas, certain results of those planned changes feasible? It's the intersection of both that gives you the SAMR model. So that's the first thing, a different way of thinking about SAMR. And the second aspect I always like to point out is SAMR is not a model for judgment. In other words, as you go from substitution to augmentation to modification to redefinition, yes, you get greater impact upon student outcomes. Yes, you can do things that you couldn't do before. Yes, there are many possibilities open up that weren't open before, but that doesn't mean that working at the lower levels of SAMR is a bad thing in and of itself. In other words, doing something at the substitution level is not necessarily bad. It may be perfectly appropriate. Doing something at augmentation is not by itself necessarily better than doing more things at substitution. You have to think about how you build up on things. The reason you'd like to get to a substantive percentage of teaching practice being at the highest levels, modification and redefinition, is because those are the levels that introduce the greatest impact, have the greatest possibility to change, improve student outcomes, but in and of themselves, there's nothing better or worse. In other words, what you want to look at is the whole set, the whole ensemble of practice. So that's also important. Again, it's not a question of saying to somebody, oh, you're doing that at substitution, you're a bad person, or you're doing a bad thing. That's not true at all. Maybe perfectly appropriate, and that's fine. Maybe all they need to do with that, and that's fine. The question is, how do you build upon that? How do you build upon that? Because when you're looking at saying what's happening in my classrooms, in my school, etc., when you're saying, well, on a bigger SAMR picture, what's happening, it's not a question of an individual activity, it's a question of what percentage of the use is at a given level. And yes, there is a strong incentive to say how much of the practice is at the higher levels, because that's where the greatest changes can occur. All right, so that's a little bit of backdrop. What I'm going to do now is say, okay, so the question that I got was, how do we use SAMR and associated uses of technology most effectively to improve student outcomes? And there's many, many ways. But I want to show you one approach that has worked really, really well for me, as well as for people using similar approaches. And that is to say, well, what happens if I take SAMR and I harness it to another model that also represents things that I would like to see happen with students at progressively greater or higher levels? Now, there are several different models you can use for this. You could use Bloom's taxonomy, and for those of you who are interested, I wrote a small article about this, and it's on the Common Sense Media site. But today, if we can go to the next slide, I want to show you how to harness SAMR to web, in other words, to the depth of knowledge model. What I can say is say, look, there's an infinity of things I could use the technology for, that I could choose to introduce the use of technology guided by SAMR at different levels, et cetera, et cetera. But in particular, as a teacher, I'm going to focus on saying, I'm going to make the lower levels of SAMR correspond to the lower levels of web. The upper levels of SAMR correspond to the upper levels of web. I want to emphasize that this is a marriage of convenience, not a marriage of necessity. I could be doing things at the extended thinking level, say, using substitution level tools, and vice versa. I could be doing things at the recall and reproduction using tools at the redefinition level. So all of those are possibilities. Or I could be making any sort of mix and match of levels of SAMR, levels of web. There is no necessary correspondence here. But there is a very good convenient correspondence here that helps me direct how I might focus my efforts as a teacher, how I might choose to change a unit of practice, because I say, well, look, I know web, I know what it does for me, I know how this is going to be reflected in student outcomes. I'm then going to harness my use of technology to make a one-to-one match, so that as I progress from the web perspective, from depth of knowledge, I'll also be doing this from a SAMR perspective, up the levels of the ladder. So that's the general idea. I find that these ideas work best if introduced by an example, so I'm going to show you just one such example. So if we can go to the next slide. I'm doing this with an example drawn from the topic of urban agriculture. Now, this is a bit of a personal passion of mine. It's a topic I think is hugely important. Some of you know I live in Western Massachusetts, very, very urban area, all of 6,000 people. So a bit different from Los Angeles, but whether you're looking at that type of a community or a place like Los Angeles, the idea of saying, how do you get students, children to think about, the process of producing food themselves, creating by agriculture food, the whole process of thinking about that, what's involved, what it can do for a community if it's incorporated as a practice in the community as a whole, can have a huge impact. So that's why I chose that as a topic. And I want to show you a very quick example. The example is laid out in the form of what I call a SAMR ladder, in which not only am I harnessing SAMR to web, but in addition to that, I'm going to be going progressively through the unit in the order of the successive steps. So I start at substitution at the beginning of the unit, develop into augmentation, from there to modification, from there to redefinition. Again, this is not a necessary progression. You might be starting at modification, redefinition, whatever is appropriate for that particular case. But I find it simplest sometimes if I explain the topic following this progression. And it can also be, by the way, for a teacher who's just starting out in their use of technology, a particularly straightforward or easy way to incorporate technology into their practice. So we start at substitution, and here I'm going to say, well, okay, what would I have the students do? I'd have them learn some of the basics of what's involved in an urban agriculture project, some of the aspects of plants that were going to be involved, soil, etc. And I'm going to use the computer to, for instance, acquire knowledge about this. So not just books or papers or articles about this, but also, for instance, there are small courses, right? OER courses that students can take online that they can extract knowledge from. So they're going to be using their tablet or laptop or whatever it is to acquire this knowledge. So we're straight at the recall and reproduction stage in terms of web, level in terms of web. And well, what I'm doing here is straight substitution. Everything I could have done here, I could have done just with paper, okay? I could have done it with traditional resources, but in this case, the technology allows me to access these resources. In particular, some of the interesting things that might happen is some of these resources might have been created actually by other students, and that's something that's very intriguing that has become possible now to access because of social media, because of social storage on places like YouTube, to access that. So that it becomes intriguing, but again, we're still at straight substitution. There really is no change, and I would expect no change in outcomes vis-a-vis what I could do with traditional paper. All right, so if we go to the next slide, now we're going to build upon this. And what I want now the students to do is to elaborate what they have acquired from a web perspective, develop certain skills, elaborate concepts, integrate concepts. And one of the things they're going to need to do is they're going to need to say, okay, I have all this knowledge, but now I need to do something. So I'm going to ask the students to actually put together small tutorial videos explaining how to do something. So here, for instance, we have a video that's been put together by a student to explain how you check some leafy greens to make sure they have no pests, that they're not wilting, that their fertilizer levels are appropriate, etc. So they've created a small interactive step-by-step video, and this is going to allow them to share with their fellow classmates what they are developing at this level, how they are understanding these skills, etc. So they're now putting together materials that are not generic, like the ones I started out with before. They are now creating materials that are targeted for both what they need to learn to know how to do, as well as what their fellow classmates are going to need to do. This puts me straight at the augmentation level. Yes, it's something I could have done with traditional media, right? Just by having them write, make sketches and so on, but it's augmented. It's augmented because one of the things I've done now is I've created something that can be easily and readily shared, for instance, via YouTube or a local video server in this regard. It's also something that can have a feedback loop associated with it. So for instance, students can say, well, gee, this works better for me, this didn't work better, could you explain it better, and so on. So the students can re-edit whatever they've created so it better serves that. And this is a type of feedback loop that would have been difficult to implement prior to the access to the technology. Finally, the technology allows me to integrate different media. So it's not just a piece of paper and a sketch. I can say, well, hold on. If I'm going to show somebody, for instance, how to cull greens so that a pest doesn't spread to the rest of the crop, I can explain it with 10,000 drawings on a piece of paper, but if I show you a video saying, and this is how you do it, bingo, you've got it. And the fact that I can integrate this, once again, enhances what I could do before, so it puts it straight at the augmentation level. If I were to do a one-to-one comparison in terms of how students perform at this level compared to, say, doing it with traditional media, I would expect to see a small but noticeable improvement. I'm going to actually put some numbers on this, but let's keep going. So if I go to the next slide, now I'm going to go to strategic thinking. So now I need the students going beyond just the basic concepts. I need them to take all of the concepts from this area and do some forward planning. Decide if X and Y, then Z. So for instance, let's assume that what I want the students doing as part of this project is this project is going to move from just a few experimental plantings and so on to actually developing a full crop, if you will, that's going to be sold to benefit the school or the community. So the students now need to plan, well, what am I going to plant? Why am I going to plant it? How am I going to do this? So what I've got here is an app that allows the students to do just that, lay out the crops, but they'll also get warnings about, by the way, this crop has yields in this season, this crop tends to attract this type of plague, that crop tends to not attract it. In other words, it gives them the tools. So instead of saying, well, gee, I like carrots, therefore I'm going to plant a lot of carrots, it gives them the tools to start thinking about how everything they've seen in the two previous levels fits together in terms of planning. And what the technology does is it gives them a certain groundwork for significantly modifying the task. Remember, now we're at the modification level. So at the modification level, we have the heart of the task being the same as before. I would always have asked them, plan out what you're going to plant in this garden, et cetera, et cetera. But now I'm significantly modifying the task by providing them with decision support software. That's essentially what this is. That allows them to lay out the garden. It allows them to see the consequences. They can start getting things like costs when this would be planted and so on. In other words, the way in which students are thinking about how to plant this garden has been significantly modified from what could have happened otherwise, what would have come before. And again, this is tied at a web level with strategic thinking. Here I would expect to see significant improvements in student outcomes. Again, we'll come to some numbers later, but let's go to the next slide where we see, okay, end of the term or end of the unit, really, not term. What are we going to do? And now, okay, from a web perspective, we'll get into extended thinking. Now they need to be thinking not just about how to integrate within one sphere, they need to be reaching across spheres, they need to be integrating across different concept areas to come up with new strategies, new planning, new integration of knowledge, and so on. Remember that I said that this garden was designed to be such that its crops could be sold. So I'm going to ask the students now to plan out and to evolve their planning as the crops come in, as the sales go in. For, is this working? Should we scrap all of the peppers, say, from this and plant celery instead? What should be going on? And of course, I need to provide them with the visualization and analysis tools to do that. And again, one of the tricks here is now I can have the students do something I could not have reasonably asked them to do prior to the advent of the technology. Prior to the advent of technology, there was simply too much data, too hard to put together. It would not have been possible to do much more other than summative. Did our garden make more money? Yes, no, that's it. Here I can ask them, no, on the fly, as you're going along, suddenly all your carrots wilted. Well, again, traditionally it would have been, and so the carrots went, the end. Here I can say, well, okay, so quickly, what can you plant now? Remember, we have all of that support, all of that knowledge from before that will help you round out the gap that the carrots left or what have you. In other words, what the software is allowing my students to do here is to engage in a form of extended thinking where they're integrating what they know about how to cultivate crops, what grows, how to make this work better or worse, with what they know about what people want to buy, what people want to eat, how much they're willing to pay for it, and what their targets are financially, how to balance costs versus profits, etc. So it definitely meets extended thinking, and it also meets redefinition in terms of being the type of project I could not have done before prior to the advent of the technology. In this particular case, it's not just a modification like I had at the previous level. This is not. Reasonably, I could not have asked for this before. So this is an example of how to rethink a unit of instruction using SAMR tied to web for a particular purpose. At each level, I said, what would I like the students to be doing? What type of thinking from the depth of knowledge perspective? And then I said, given this and given the context of the unit, how do I use the technology to best achieve those results? That's, again, just one example. But what I want to emphasize is that what this allows you to do is to have, in addition to a guide for how to use the technology and a guide that's connected to something a teacher also knows, it also allows you to get away from one of the challenges that people say to themselves, well, the technology is one more thing added to the table. If you can make it so that the other things on the table, whether it's, okay, we're going to be using a DOK approach or a Bloom-inspired approach, or we're going to use a project-based or challenge-based learning approach, if you can say, well, okay, let me take the components of that, break it apart, and tie it to SAMR and to a progression through a technology, you've successfully answered that question. In other words, you've made it easier for people to adopt the use of the technology. I say this is just one example, but I wanted to show it to you as an example of how the whole thing works. And also for those of you who might be a little bit less familiar with SAMR, see a little bit of a more in terms of what's involved in a progression through the levels. And I want to emphasize this particular approach in which you go through a unit, say it's called the SAMR ladder. I didn't come up with that term. Let me give credit where credit is due. Jim Moulton, we've been working in Maine for quite some time. We had come up with lots of the examples like this where we were progressing through a unit of instruction in this way. And Jim says, gee, they kind of look like a ladder. Shouldn't we call them maybe SAMR ladders? I said, Jim, you got it. So Jim gets full credit for it. But when you hear the term SAMR ladder, sometimes I hear it used to the model as a whole. The model as a whole does not say there's a necessary progression of any sort. It just applies to this particular type of use, which, again, can be very powerful, very useful, particularly for a beginning teacher, but is by no means prescriptive in any sense of the word. All right. I said, okay, we start out with next to no impact, that substitution on outcomes, small impact, larger impact, dramatic impact. Let's put some numbers on that. So if I can go to the next slide. Okay, this is a test for your eyesight, all the way back in the last row. Can you tell me what Roblier's score was? Okay. you've got all of these slides available to you, and by the way, please feel free to reuse them. I always make my slides available under Creative Commons, so feel free to share with your communities, teachers, etc., as desirable or useful. What I've got here is from the work of Dr. Tamim and her team, and I have a huge debt with Dr. Tamim and her team, where they go back and they say, okay, there are all of these studies that have been made of the use of technology over the years. These studies have in turn been aggregated into meta-studies, where we take a whole set of studies and we say, well, in this particular area, was the net result positive, negative of the use of technology in education? Well, they've done a meta-study of meta-studies now, in which they've taken all of those meta-studies, analyzed them, reanalyzed all the studies that were dependent upon, and then said, this is the picture that emerges. So this encompasses over 1,000 individual studies, okay, as you can see, a couple of dozen meta-studies of those studies. And the first thing you want to look at, and again, I realize it's a little bit of an eye test here, but is the column that says mean ES. ES stands here for effect size. And effect size, for those of you who need a quick refresher, is when you measure the improvement of the average in scores for, say, some type of standard measure in your students by taking, you have a control group that didn't use the technology, you have a test group or treatment group that used the technology, and say, well, the scores improved by this amount. The effect size is that amount measured in units of the standard deviation. So if I say, for instance, that between these two groups of students, I saw a net improvement of an effect size of 0.5, that means that the average score between the two, between treatment and control, improved by half a standard deviation. All right, that's the effect size. Even if you can't read the numbers, the first thing that should strike you is all of the column that says mean ES is positive with exactly one exception. Okay? Now that exception is Koufogianakis and Wiebe, and it's a tiny, tiny little negative number. It's actually very close to 0. It's worthwhile looking at why that particular set of uses yields a negative effect size. But the thing is, the remaining 1,000 plus all yield positive numbers. So this is an important thing to take away right off the bat. For people who say, well, we haven't studied it enough, yes, we have. We really have. And the result of using technology in education in terms of student outcomes is a net positive, all right? Now, some of those numbers are bigger, some of them are smaller. How do we know which ones which way gives me the biggest numbers or the biggest impact? Say hello once again to SAMR. Let's see what this looks like, for instance, through a SAMR lens, if we can do the next slide. This is just for actually one meta study done by Tamim and her team, okay? And this is, for instance, for tablets in education. This is a very recent meta study, it came out last year. And what you see here is I can say, well, okay, I can take it from where Dr. Tamim and her team left it. I can look at each of these uses and assign to it, whether it's substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition. And you get this curve over here. You can see that the average for substitution is around 0, although there's a spread there. Then you have a small around 0.3 to 0.4 result for augmentation, around 0.75 to 0.8 for modification, and roughly double that again for redefinition. So you tend to see a net set here that's negligible, vanishing, small, roughly double that at modification, roughly double that at redefinition. So this is what SAMR is telling you. If you're doing things at the upper levels of SAMR, the odds of having a large positive impact upon student outcomes are much greater by virtue of this, okay? So roughly an effect size of around 0.4 or thereabouts for A, 0.8 or thereabouts for modifications, 1.6 or thereabouts for redefinition. There tends to be more noise at both ends of the scale, so both at substitution and redefinition, you have a broader spectrum of actual outcomes, but the averages or medians, depending on how you're doing this either way, come out to those numbers I just gave you. Let's put this in other terms. If you're not used to thinking in terms of effect sizes, if you want to think about this in terms of percentile shifts, this corresponds to substitution, nearly no shift. Augmentation, a shift from about the 50th to about the 66th percentile. Modification, a shift from about the 50th to around the 80th, 79th to 80th percentile or thereabouts. Redefinition from about the 50th to about the 94th to 95th percentile. That's what you're looking at. So again, when you're trying to get a grasp on magnitude, why is there a payoff? In other words, is it just a little bit when you go to redefinition as compared to substitution? No, it's a lot more. And again, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean that doing something at substitution is bad, but it does mean that you want to insofar as possible, wherever possible, develop the overall set of your practices. So they point more towards modification, redefinition. All right, so that was the first part, the question of individual student outcomes. The second question I had then on the table was, what else can you do with teachers in such a way as to help them develop within a school? I want to show you a couple of things in that regard. So if you can go to the next slide. What you can do is you can introduce a second model that I've developed. It's called the EdTech Quintet. The EdTech Quintet says, okay, there's lots of technologies. Which are the ones that matter the most? Which are the ones that have the most powerful proven outcomes? And I've got, all of these slides have references if you want to find out more about how this research was conducted. I was leveraging the work of the Horizon Project, et cetera, and what some of these numbers, like those strange 200,000 years, I didn't realize the iPad had been out that long. Or maybe it's Chromebooks have been out that long? Either way. But there are connections to certain historical processes, et cetera. And I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to introduce the idea of saying, well, you're working with teachers, and teachers are confronted by this huge array of technologies. How do you tell them what is most powerful, what they want to focus on? And also, from your perspective as well, what type of tool range do you want to make sure you have available on the machines? What type of experiences do you want to make possible through the tool sets available on the laptops or tablets or whatever it is you're using? So the 5 categories are social tools. These are the tools we use to collaborate, communicate with each other, share what we've created, either separately or jointly, comment on, etc. So those are all the social tools. The next category is mobility tools. That refers to the fact that the devices we use don't stay put. Okay, some are more mobile than the others. A smartphone is the most mobile of all the devices, but even so, even a fairly hefty laptop is still mobile. That means as you're planning activities, you want to think about how it can be used anytime, any place. You're no longer bound to one place. You don't have to go to the lab down the corridor because that's where the machine lives and it has to be plugged into the wall, etc. You can be thinking about experiences. Well, where do learning experiences make the most sense? Whether in time or in space, and it might not be within the school building or within the traditional school day. And you want to think about the other tools then that are associated with this, such as sensors, a camera or an audio microphone are the simplest sensors, but of course you can measure location, temperature, etc. So all the things that allow a device to interact with its surroundings, no matter where it is, and also then ways that the device can be used to create, to explore, etc. Again, not fixed to a particular moment or location, but rather wherever it makes sense for that educational experience. The third category is visualization. We have abstract concepts, and abstract concepts are tricky to wrap your head around. So visualization tools say you can take an abstract concept and make it tangible. And by making it tangible, by being able to see it in 2 or 3 dimensions, be able to do something with it. So for instance, an abstract concept is a concept of space. Space is an abstract concept. How do we visualize space? We call it maps. And a digital map has a whole series of affordances and richness that go beyond what a paper map can do, because it can be linked to other sources, it can have layers that can be turned on or off. Time is an abstract concept. Timelines allow us to visualize time. We can also visualize connections between things. If those things that happen to be connected are concepts, we call the result a concept map. If what's being connected are animals in an ecosystem and plants, we call it a food web. If what's being connected are people in a society, we call them a social network map. But all of these are ways of visualizing the abstraction involved in connecting things. And of course, we can visualize connections or relationships between words. If you've ever used a wordle, you've seen a way of doing it. And needless to say, we can visualize numbers with different charts, graphs, with different interactivity relative to them. Next category is digital storytelling. Digital storytelling refers to being able to use image, video, sound, music, your own voice, etc., whether in still format or over time, as in a movie might be, to tell a story. Now the question is, why is digital storytelling powerful? Well, we tell stories to make meaning for others. By making meaning for others, we make meaning for ourselves. So digital storytelling, if you will, gives us a set of tools that allow us to make meaning for both others and ourselves, to integrate what we've learned. And finally, gaming. And what gaming allows us to do is to say, well, you have something that might be intriguing by itself, but can you add some drive to it? Can you add the desire to say, can I really push this forward? The idea of winning a game is associated with the idea of saying, well, for instance, say you have something like a city simulator, like SimCity. If you're just looking at the individual elements, you might say, well, this is how transportation interacts with buildings and roads and so on. But if I construct a game around it, and I challenge the students to say, now build me the biggest city, the richest city, the most powerful city, etc., the city most like Los Angeles, then you've suddenly created a drive that drives the student to better understand the relationship between transportation, roads, etc., to understand what's going on. And I'm therefore driving the learning process forward. So these 5 categories, social, mobility, visualization, storytelling, and gaming, the EdTech Quintet, are the particularly powerful tools. And as you're working with teachers, you want to think about to say, okay, how do you introduce them to these categories? How do you make sure they have the tools? And how do you encourage them to explore the use of the tools as they start with their first few projects? So if we can go to the next slide, this is just a summary of what I just said, so let's go one more. Okay, so you've got your teachers at your school, you're just starting out. And a lot of teachers say, I'm scared, or I've never done this, or I don't know where to start. One thing I encourage people to do is to say, look, set aside a day in your professional learning plan to get teachers into a room in groups of somewhere between 3 to 5 people. At least 3, no more than 5. That seems to be a particularly good size for this. And encourage them in those groups to work on one unit of instruction, not their entire curriculum, just pick one unit of instruction that they would like to change, that they would like to use technology to change because of one of these 3 reasons. One, the one I call your passion, is because it's something they care about deeply. It's something they think is beautiful and powerful and they think every student should get. A second option is what I call the barriers. So you're saying to teachers, look, is there a unit of instruction that really students hit and bam, it's running into a brick wall and you lose a lot of your students there? Okay, focus on using how you might use technology to change that unit of instruction. And the last option is what I call the amnesia option. It's a little bit more whimsical. I say, okay, pretend your students are going to forget, for reasons that you have no control over, so you can't change that, everything they learned in your class this year except for one thing. Now you get to pick that thing for whatever reason you like, because it's more powerful or beautiful or rich. That's up to you. But the thing is, design a unit of instruction to make sure that that one thing sticks in students' minds. These 3, I find, provide a particularly powerful or good framework for teachers to use to explore when they're trying to work in groups on this first unit of instruction to construct a SAMR ladder in terms of how they're going to use technology to change that unit of instruction. That works particularly well for 2 reasons. Number 1, any one of these 3 reasons, teachers can see the payoff. And that's something we already heard this morning, right? You want it to be high payoff, not the low payoff, easy stuff. No. All of these teachers look at and say, oh yeah, I see why that matters. The second reason is that these things tend to be towards the forefront of people's thinking, towards the forefront of teachers' thoughts. So it's easier for them to undertake this, to accomplish this, in terms of their first few steps in this. My experience is if you bring teachers into a room, give them about somewhere between 1 to 3 hours, and say, okay, do this in teams. My experience is before they do this, they say, oh, it's going to take me weeks, months, years to figure out how to do this. After they've done this, they say, okay, I can see how I might be able to do it. I usually ask them, what you have at the end of 1 to 3 hours is pretty rough, but can you see how to polish it? And the answer in general will be, yeah, I can see where another weeks or so worth of work, I could polish this. So that's a good way to see how to get teachers started. So introduce them to the EdTech Quintet, set them up with this. If we go to the next slide now. One thing you would like to have happen throughout your school is to have shared practices. And by shared practices, I call these consensus practices. These are things that people agree are going to happen both within a grade level as well as across grade levels. And you've got this list over here. Again, you've got these materials available to you, so I'm not going to bore you by reading the whole list. But these are simple practices that leverage the EdTech Quintet in ways that are particularly useful, etc. So for instance, you have how everything from developing shared checklists to simple blogging, basic visualization. Let me just take one example. Let's take an example from visualization. If I agree, if a common shared practice among all teachers is going to be the use of timelines, I can start with that in K or pre-K, where kids don't even have a notion necessarily yet of what a clock is in detail, but they say, well, my day starts here, and then it goes on to here, and then it goes on here. So now when move forward a couple of years, and now they're in first, second grade, and now I can have them start to explore more the idea of time through the year, the seasons, what happens through the seasons. They get older, now we're getting more into history, and they can start exploring what a personal, historical, as opposed to on the scale of the country, as opposed to longer historical timelines look like. So I can develop this longitudinally. I can also use it within a grade. So say I don't know, pick any, let's say it's fourth grade, okay? And I'm the teacher, I'm doing history, and I'm saying, well, I'm using timelines for this. And now the phys ed specialist comes along and says, oh, you know what? This is great because I want students to understand in, say, the baseball team, how the gameplay changes throughout the game. And then somebody else could say, well, this is great because I'd like also to use this for planning. So at the same time, because it's a shared practice, it can be used by multiple teachers that are involved in the work with students in a given grade. So shared practices allow you to develop forward and allow you to develop within a grade. And the beauty of this is once you have these agreed upon, once the students have developed this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time one of these comes up. In other words, you can always say, I know students have seen timelines. I know I can build upon this. Let me develop forward. And this is a list that, as I say, over the years I've found works particularly well. Finally, if we go to the next slide, one of the other things that I find works particularly well in terms of saying, okay, so how do teachers best continue to develop their practice? How do you have a sustainable evolution of use of technology in a school? You really need two things. One of the things you need is a community of practice. And again, you've got the formal definition there if you want to look it up together with references. But the key thing is you want a school where teachers are when they meet in the corridors over lunch, on a break, etc., not just for departmental meetings, okay? Not just for formal meetings, but in general, exchange tokens of their practice. Talk on what's working, what's not working, and how. So that the integration of technology is not something that every teacher does on their own or only gets talked about in the departmental meeting and that's it. But actually the evolution, the development of this, I'm using this, the example I was giving you for shared practices, etc., are things that are habitually exchanged in daily interactions. The tokens of conversation, if you will, become the how am I using this, what am I doing with it, and so on. And it's important to realize, by the way, that tools such as the SAMR model, classifications like the EdTech Quintet, etc., help in this regard. Because I might have two teachers, say I'm in a high school. I've got the math teacher, the history teacher, and the French teacher, all talking to each other, right? And having a common language that they can use as an interpreter between their different specialties, like SAMR, like the EdTech Quintet, helps bridge that process. It helps cement, solidify the community of practice. The other aspect you want is we want teachers, at least a significant percentage of the teachers, not necessarily all of them, but a significant percentage, to have personal learning networks. And by personal learning network, I mean each teacher reaching out for information or knowledge they will be of use in their area. And for one teacher, it might be through Facebook. For another one, it might be they go to professional society meetings and stay in email contact with other people. For other people, it might be reading blogs. For another person, it might be using Twitter as a source of information. But whatever it is, they're reaching outside the boundaries of their community for new ideas, resources, elements they're going to use. And that introduction freshens the ideas within the community. If you don't have that, you can have a very tightly knit community with a good community of practice, but go stale. After a while, you don't have enough ideas coming in from the outside. And we know this, there have been many decades of study of this, but you can go all the way back to the 60s and Granovetter's study of what he called the strength of weak ties, where he showed that resiliency of communities and long-term stability is directly tied to these ties that go outside of the community, that bring in fresh elements, fresh components from outside the community. So this is the other component I wanted to highlight, the idea that these communities of practice and personal learning networks, if you can foster them, develop them, encourage the opportunities for them in your school, these are elements that help develop teaching practice. One last item, and I'll wrap up, which has to do with the third question I was asked, and that is, okay, so you're projecting this into the bigger community. What do you do? Well, you can see already that the first item I talked about already projected into the second, right? Because everything I talked about how to use something you already know or are using as a goal, such as web, can be used to harness it to SAMR and in turn help develop this, and you saw what the outcomes could be. And then we talked about specific elements in terms of what happens with a teaching community. And something similar happens when you go into the parents community. So in fact, the more you can get parents and the overall community aware of elements like this, the more you can have strands of experience. You know, people always ask me, how do you get parents to buy in? Listen, the more you can get them, and I realize it can be a hard sell sometimes to get parents to show up, believe me. But the more you can get them to get their hands dirty, to set up small experiences. You know, one of the reasons I use the urban agriculture example is that's when you can explain to a parent. You don't have to get into obscure points of vocabulary development to explain how you're using technology. That might be wonderful, but it's going to be a little tricky for somebody who doesn't have a degree in education to understand it. That's an example you can show to parents and maybe have them get their hands dirty with some of the software experiences and so on. And they say, oh yeah, I get this. And you can introduce them. I've worked with schools in Vermont, for instance, that have used SAMR to talk with students and with parents. Again, because it's simple and direct enough that they can say, oh, okay, I see what you're trying to do. So all the elements I've talked about work well in terms of bringing this to parents. But I want to show you one last set of results, which I've just had for about a month, even a little less than that, which I think are powerful in terms of addressing some concerns and moving forward. So if I can go to the next slide. Okay. How many, quick show of hands, how many people here have already looked at or seen the latest PISA results? These came out late last year, so I see a few hands. Okay. For those of you who haven't, the Organization for Economic Community Development, OECD, every so many years has what's called the PISA test, and the PISA tests are an evaluation of where countries are at in three key areas, reading, mathematics, and science, to say, okay, what's the relative level of performance? What makes the PISA results particularly unique as compared to, say, TIMSS, which is another great set of results, et cetera, is that PISA is calibrated by other research projects against what you expect for economic outcomes in your country. So you can tie differences in PISA results to, well, this is going to result in a net difference in, a locally corrected, et cetera, economic outcomes for people. And this becomes very important because you're saying, if I'd like my population to overall have access to good jobs, what do they need to have in terms of being able to access the job market? So what I've done is I've analyzed the PISA results. Now, a lot of people, if we can go to the next slide, view this. This is a long list. Another quick test. Quick, tell me for Indonesia, what's the third score, right? A lot of people take the scores and view them almost as a horse race. Oh, my country is doing better than your country by 1 point, yay! That's not useful. That's not useful because in some cases you're looking at point differences that are meaningless, and then you might be doing a little better in reading, but a little worse in math. What's it all mean? That's not a good way of looking at it. So if we go to the next slide, my own approach is to say, let's look at the tests as a set and look at clusters of results. Now, what do I mean by a cluster? A cluster are groups of countries that are performing a certain way. And one of the nice things about doing a good cluster analysis is instead of saying, well, tell me the top 10%, well, why 10? Why not 9 or 11, right? I can just say, tell me how many logical clusters this develops into, and this is the result that I get from my own analysis. If anybody wants, I can explain afterwards how I do it, but the key element is you no longer have a simple, okay, country number 1 to et cetera. You have groups of countries that, yes, some perform better, and you go down the list to others that perform worse. The United States is in the third group, the green group, but we also have information about some other subsets of the US. We have information about Massachusetts, North Carolina, and Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, we don't have detailed information about the other states. And you'll notice that Massachusetts performs above where the United States does. In other words, it looks more like a country in group 2. Puerto Rico, on the other hand, performs more like a country in the same group as Brazil, Peru, Jordan, Georgia, and Indonesia. So the bottom line is this allows you to start saying, well, if we have groups of countries that perform a certain way, why? What do they have in common? What do they have that's different? And why? And one of the interesting things is, if I look at that top group, there are very different styles of teaching. So anybody who says, oh, it's because of how Singapore does math or how Finland doesn't do preschool, etc., those are not commonalities. But you know two commonalities in that top group? One, high respect for teachers. In every single one of those countries, teachers are highly respected. That's one important one. Number two, they're not scared to take risks. In every single one of those countries in the top group, they have not had the same education system decade in, decade out. They've been willing to take risks. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but they've been willing to experiment. Those features, those two are consistently present in the top group. They are not consistently present anywhere else. And I could make other comparisons, etc. Fine. So I've got that. Why am I going to this? Because I want to show you a couple of interesting results that I've found based on how students use technology in these country groups. So if we go to the next slide, there's a question that's part of PISA. So during a typical day, how long do you use the internet outside of school, right? And you have everything from no time up to more than 6 hours. And you have, this is in Singapore, the distribution. And we could say, well, one of the concerns that people have is screen time and how long kids are on. Remember, this is not for schoolwork alone. This is everything. This is Facebook. This is everything in the world, okay? So we can say, okay, so how does this relate to scores? And this is what we get if we go to the next slide. The dotted lines are the averages for math, reading, and science. What I will point out is those students that spend no time or very low amounts of time score consistently lower than the average than those students who spend more time. In fact, you find that the optimum is somewhere in between 1 and 2 hours, between 2 and 4 hours. Then it starts to drop off, and if it's more than 6 hours, yeah, that's too much. So you start to see a pattern here that allows you to say, okay, students are getting something from the internet that affects their scores, even if it's not oriented towards classwork. So we have a positive impact. There is a value to what students are getting. Let's go to the next slide, though, because you might say, okay, Ruben, but that's Singapore. That's the top score. Maybe they're really weird kids, and they're the only ones in the world. So, of course, I do this for other countries, and I do it for, since I told you Puerto Rico is more like Brazil, fine, let's do it for Brazil. Very different curve you'd expect it for socioeconomic reasons. Let's see what happens in the next screen. Lower numbers, but the pattern is much the same, except that, if anything, it's shifted actually a little more towards the right, towards spending more time. You know, more than 6 hours is still not great, but the overall curve is clearly in the direction of somewhere between 2 and 4 and 4 and 6 hours. So I'm seeing this pattern. But wait, you could say, but Ruben, here's what's probably happening. It's a socioeconomic effect. All the kids scoring well are from higher socioeconomic status. All the kids scoring poorly are from low socioeconomic status. Fine. So we need a marker for socioeconomic status. Now we could use money, and I have used it, income, but let's use something else. Let's use the number of books that a child has in their home. That's a double indicator because it's both how much money do you have to buy books, but also how many of these cultural objects do you have. So let's go to the next slide. And here's what you see. No matter where you are socioeconomically in Singapore, the curve looks essentially the same. In the last one, you have missing columns because there isn't enough data. There aren't enough people in those brackets. Is it the same in Brazil? Let's go to the next slide. Yes, it is. In other words, this is telling you something very important about what I would call baseline use. So when people tell me about one-to-one, well, no, let's keep it at school because we want it just used for school because otherwise they're wasting their time. And if they're wasting their time, they go, cool down, folks. This is telling me no. Independent exploration is valuable. One-to-one, in terms of what kids can get out of it, is valuable because it opens up possibilities that are not necessarily framed in traditional schoolwork, but still have value. Now, what if we do look at traditional schoolwork? So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is how often do you use a computer for browsing the internet. Again, these are the percentages in Singapore. Go to the next one. And lo and behold, you can see that there's value for using the computer. This is just one of many questions that have been asked. I'm just showing you the simplest one, how you often use it for browsing. And you'll notice that somewhere in the almost every day to every day is the domain. And again, that's something you need a one-to-one program for. That's something that child needs to have access to a technology regularly for. If they only have it occasionally, you see things drop off. If you see it never or hardly ever outside of school, notice how far below the averages are for the results. Again, let's make sure Singapore isn't weird. Let's see what happens in Brazil. Those are the percentages. Next slide. Once again, you see that. Now you see that there's more of a drop-off towards every day. And there you do see a socioeconomic effect. If you're asking students to do something every day, you say a computer, but they don't have access to a computer every day, then you're beginning to impose a penalty. So this is yet another case for why you want to make sure that from an equity perspective, you're there. So that's the third aspect I wanted to show you. So for when you look at the overall picture for how you incorporate the devices into the broader perspective with parents, this is yet another piece of the puzzle. And for the last slide, again, you've got access to all this, but if you'd like to contact me, and that's my blog, email, Twitter account. So at this point, I want to thank you all for your time, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.